Ninthany Tentano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for a review of the new Sufjan Stevens record, Carrie Lowell. National treasure, indie darling, multi-instrumentalist, singer-songwriter, and composer Sufjan Stevens, whose discography has grown increasingly eccentric over the years. You have his big breakout albums loaded with contemporary folk music as well as chamber pop like Michigan and Illinois. Albums that were not only loaded with tracks that reference the history of these two wonderful states, but there were also personal and painfully shy and sad songs on this record as well, and that was contrasted by bits of very epic, grand, lush instrumentation. There are also quite a bit of religious undertones that run through many a record from Mr. Stevens. He has numerous Christmas albums under his belt. Some of his records are hip-hop themed, from the kind of tongue-in-cheek Chopped and Scrooged to the sort of weird collaborative project Sisyphus that dropped last year that really went over better than it should have. Of course, there is also the modern classical suite, the BQE, an instrumental tribute to New York's Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, and Mr. Stevens is no stranger to electronic music, either with records like Enjoy Your Rabbit, as well as The Age of Odds, one of his bigger conceptual records with tons of sequenced drums and synthesizers and very textured, glitchy electronics. Not really a high point for me in his discography, though it seems to be for many. However, this new record, Carrie Lowell, is taking a much more simple approach. Sufjan is really stripping layers away, remodeling, and kind of going back to very acoustic basics. This is a very quiet, intimate, subtle, and ballad-driven album. And incredibly personal, too. Stevens is really just singing about personal experiences on this album. And with his vocals, his instrumentation, he sort of takes a musical tone similar to that of like an Elliott Smith record. And his Paul Simon fandom is a little bit more readable with things being so simple and straightforward. However, even though Stevens isn't piling on the sounds and the instrumentation as he typically does, this album doesn't feel like a regression or anything like that. A lot of the tracks here are actually a testament to Stevens' growth as a songwriter, that he can come together with pieces of music that are so skeletal and still deliver a compelling song. That also has a lot to do with the emotional quality of these tracks and the tales being told in the lyrics. From what I can tell, the entirety of this album is inspired by the recent passing of Stevens' mother, and not only does he reflect on her death, but a lot of childhood memories as well in relation to her, or just family. The opening track on this record is gorgeous. There's a folky, little plucky melody that is very quiet, very gentle. In the lyrics, Stevens is singing about his mother's ghost and forgiveness. But reading into this track and others on this LP as well, I kind of get the feeling that the relationship Stevens had with his mother wasn't the best. If I'm hearing things correctly, it sounds like on the song Should Have Known Better that Stevens is kind of avoiding his mother in her time of extreme sickness, maybe even when she's on her deathbed. They're just not talking. He's waiting for there to be some kind of cure or some kind of turnaround or something. It just seems like he's distancing himself from the situation. And he sings about being 3 years old and left at the video store, but also acknowledging that the past is the past. It seems like on a lot of this record, Stevens is trying to come to terms with horrible things he might have done, things that he has for a very long time not forgiven his mother for. He's simultaneously grieving and trying to come to terms with these events in the past that he might have been emotionally scarred by. And he does this over fingerpick guitars and some really breezy, beautiful background vocals. The track Drawn to Blood seems like Stevens is, I guess, sort of dealing with the initial shock of some kind of maybe bloody and violent trauma. And his approach to this track instrumentally is so simple. The rhythm of this song is essentially kept by these single electric piano notes. And with The Only Thing, which has some fantastic strings on it, and the 4th of July, we again are getting just very beautiful, soft music set against some kind of morbid lyrics, and very intense in the way that they approach personal tragedy. Lyrically, Stevens really doesn't pull many punches when it comes to some of the refrains over these alluring folk ditties, asking, should I tear my heart out now? Or saying, We're All Gonna Die. I guess my issue though with a lot of this LP is that Stevens' vocals for the entire album aren't much louder than a whisper. And I guess in theory I don't mind a subtler approach, but I think this album specifically could have used a little bit more variety. I think the record starts with some good intentions and some great songs too, but things really, I don't want to say fall apart, but definitely wind down quality-wise in the second half. We are met with some songs that have some very abrupt endings. The closing track on this album actually features what I would even call a non-ending, just kind of these very ethereal tones just pop in out of nowhere and then just glide the track out, the entire album out really suddenly. Stevens is not really teasing all the potential out of these songs that he could. He's really just developing them to the point where he gets some kind of personal emotional exorcism out of them and then just leaving them be. Which, you know, could be a good thing or a bad thing for fans. I mean, I'm sure there are people at this point who are very invested in what Stevens is trying to do with his art emotionally. And to know that he is going through such an intense emotional grieving process through the music on this album will definitely attract some listeners and make this album feel special. But just looking at this album from a vocal delivery standpoint and from the standpoint of, you know, is there a variety of approaches and different sounds on this record? You know, does each song kind of have its own strong personality? This record definitely does leave something to be desired, because for me, as this album drew on, there were moments that were really so faint they kind of fell into the background, and I think there are some refrains and some lyrics here that the emotional impact of these tracks is sort of lessened by the fact that Stevens just feels so cold and lifeless a lot of the time with his vocals. When the album started, it certainly felt like maybe he was whispering because he was just on the brink of breaking down and crying, but I just kind of feel like that tension kind of drifted away as the record continued, and this whisper quiet vocal delivery just kind of became a thing. Just a sound, an okay sound versus a feeling. Overall, not a bad record in the Sufjan Stevens discography. I'm sure that fans are going to love it to death. For me personally, I thought there were some great tracks here. It's definitely beautiful in moments. It's certainly pleasant to listen to, but I do think there are some lackluster tracks in the second half here, and this LP can be a little one-dimensional. I'm feeling a strong 6 to a light 7 on this thing.
Transition, what did you think about this album? Love it? Hate it? Why? And what should Anthony review next? But before he puts out a new video, you can check out my channel, where I play a lot of stringed instruments. Sometimes I play Kendrick Lamar songs on an 8-string guitar, sometimes I play my own songs, other times I cover Slayer on banjo. So it's a lot of fun, and you should check it out, and maybe subscribe. And yeah, guitars, strings, forever.